I'm General Alexander Thompson, 45, and when my family banned me from my beloved grandfather's funeral because they said I was a failure who embarrassed the family name, they had no idea what they'd done. My grandfather, Colonel James Thompson, was a decorated Marine who'd raised me after my parents abandoned me, but his new wife and her greedy children convinced everyone I was worthless. When I showed up anyway to honor the man who saved my life, 12 Marines in dress blues snapped to attention and saluted me with "General, ma'am," and my family's jaws hit the floor. What happened next was the most satisfying military justice you've ever seen. What do you think my family's reaction was when they realized who I really was? Share your predictions below. If you love stories where military heroes get the respect they deserve, smash that like button and subscribe because this family revenge will restore your faith in justice. The way karma came for my toxic family is absolutely perfect. My story begins with abandonment and salvation, two forces that would shape everything about who I became and why my grandfather's funeral would deliver the most satisfying revenge of my life. When I was 8 years old, my parents decided that raising a child was incompatible with their dream of traveling the world as free spirits, so they dropped me off at my grandfather's house with a suitcase and a note saying they'd be back when they figured things out. They never came back. Colonel James Thompson, my grandfather, was a career Marine who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam, earned a Purple Heart and Silver Star, and had spent 30 years building a reputation as one of the Corps' most respected officers. At 58, he was looking forward to a quiet retirement, but instead found himself raising an 8-year-old granddaughter whose parents had essentially orphaned her to pursue their selfish dreams. "Alex," he told me on my first night in his house, "your parents made their choice, and now we'll make ours. You're going to have discipline, structure, and unconditional love for as long as I'm breathing. Understood?" Grandpa James didn't just raise me, he transformed me. Every morning started with physical training at 0600 hours. Breakfast was earned through completing chores to military standards. Homework was inspected with the same attention to detail he'd used for equipment maintenance in the Marines. But beneath the structure was a love so fierce and protective that I never doubted for a second that I was wanted, valued, and destined for greatness. "Thompson women are fighters," he'd tell me when I struggled with math homework or felt sorry for myself about my parents. "We don't quit, we don't make excuses, and we don't let anyone tell us we're not good enough. Your job is to prove that every single day." The military discipline wasn't punishment, it was preparation. Grandpa James saw potential in me that I couldn't see in myself, and he was determined to develop it through the same principles that had made him successful. By the time I was 12, I could disassemble and clean a rifle, navigate using a compass and map, and recite the Marine Corps motto, values, and history with perfect precision. But what made our relationship special wasn't the military training, it was the absolute confidence he had in my future and his unwavering commitment to preparing me for success. While other kids were playing video games, I was learning leadership principles, strategic thinking, and the kind of mental toughness that would carry me through the most challenging experiences of my life. "Alex," he said during one of our evening talks when I was 15, "someday you're going to face people who underestimate you because of your gender, your background, or their own limitations. When that happens, you remember that you were raised by a Marine, and Marines don't back down from fights they can win." High school was where Grandpa James's training really paid off. I was valedictorian, student body president, captain of 3 sports teams, and had earned early admission to West Point with a full scholarship. My grandfather's pride was visible to everyone who knew us. He attended every game, every ceremony, and every award presentation with his chest puffed out and his eyes bright with satisfaction. "That's my granddaughter," he'd tell anyone who would listen. "Raised her myself, and she's going to be somebody important someday." The day I left for West Point was emotional for both of us, but Grandpa James's send-off was perfect for a future military officer. "You've got everything you need to succeed," he told me at the airport. "Trust your training, lead from the front, and make decisions you can live with. I'll be here when you come home, and I'll be proud of you no matter what." What I didn't know was that this would be the last conversation we'd have before his life took a turn that would nearly destroy our relationship and set up the most dramatic confrontation of my life. Everything changed during my second year at West Point when Grandpa James, at 68, fell in love with a 52-year-old woman named Patricia Henley who seemed to understand exactly what she was doing when she targeted a lonely military retiree with a substantial pension and significant assets. Patricia came with 2 adult children, Michael and Jennifer, who were in their late 20s and had spent their entire lives failing to launch into successful careers. The warning signs were obvious to everyone except my lovesick grandfather. Patricia moved into his house within 3 months of meeting him, immediately began redecorating to eliminate traces of my presence and my deceased grandmother's memory, and started making subtle comments about how expensive it was to maintain connections with extended family who were busy with their own lives. Michael, 29, was a college dropout who'd never held a job for more than 6 months and had a history of borrowing money that he never repaid. Jennifer, 27, had a psychology degree that she'd never used professionally and spent most of her time pursuing unsuccessful creative projects while living off her mother's income. Both of them immediately saw my grandfather as a solution to their financial problems and a replacement for the personal responsibility they'd been avoiding their entire lives. During my brief holiday visits home, I watched Patricia systematically isolate my grandfather from his military friends, his community connections, and eventually from me. She'd schedule family activities during times when I was supposed to visit, then express disappointment that I was too busy with my military training to prioritize family relationships. "James, it's sad that Alex doesn't make time for family anymore," Patricia would say with false concern. "I understand that her military career is important, but family should come first." The manipulation was sophisticated and relentless. Patricia would create situations where defending our relationship required my grandfather to criticize her or her children, then frame his choices as evidence that he preferred his absent granddaughter over the family that was actually present in his daily life. Michael and Jennifer were equally toxic, constantly making comments about how lucky I was to have gotten a free education while they were struggling to make ends meet. They'd suggest that I was ungrateful for my grandfather's sacrifices and that my military service was just an excuse to avoid helping the family financially. "Alex acts like she's better than us because she's in the military," Jennifer would complain during family dinners. "But she's never here when Grandpa James needs help with anything." The most insidious aspect of their campaign was how they reframed my military achievements as evidence of my selfishness and abandonment of family values. Every promotion, every award, every achievement was presented as proof that I cared more about my career than about the grandfather who'd raised me. By my 3rd year at West Point, my relationship with Grandpa James had become strained and difficult. Our phone calls were shorter and less frequent, his letters contained more information about Patricia's family than about his own life, and his pride in my military accomplishments seemed to be overshadowed by guilt about not spending more time with his new family. The breaking point came during my senior year, when I learned that Patricia had convinced my grandfather to change his will to leave everything to her and her children, with only a small bequest to me in recognition of his early support for my education. The man who'd raised me and invested everything in my future had been manipulated into believing that I no longer needed or deserved his support. But I was busy with my final year at West Point, commissioning as a 2nd lieutenant, and beginning a military career that would demand everything I had to give. I didn't have time to fight Patricia's influence or try to rebuild a relationship that she was systematically destroying. What I didn't realize was that my absence from family drama was being used as evidence of my indifference to my grandfather's well-being, and that Patricia was building a narrative that would eventually be used to justify excluding me from the most important moment of his life. After graduating from West Point, I threw myself into my military career with the same intensity and dedication that Grandpa James had instilled in me from childhood. My first assignment was with the 82nd Airborne Division, where I learned that leading soldiers in combat situations required every skill my grandfather had taught me and several he couldn't have anticipated. The early years were challenging but rewarding. I led a platoon through a deployment in Afghanistan, earned my Ranger tab, completed airborne and air assault schools, and consistently received outstanding performance evaluations from superior officers who recognized my potential for advanced leadership roles. Every achievement felt like validation of my grandfather's investment in my development and proof that his training had prepared me for exactly the challenges I was facing. But the demands of military service, especially in a combat arms unit during wartime, meant that I had little time for extended family visits or long conversations about civilian life. I'd call my grandfather when I could, send letters from deployment, and visit during brief leave periods, but my focus was necessarily on the soldiers under my command and the missions we were assigned to complete. Patricia used my dedication to military service as evidence that I'd abandoned my grandfather and chosen my career over family. During my rare visits home, she'd make pointed comments about how sad it was that Grandpa James had raised me but was now alone in his old age while I was gallivanting around the world playing soldier. "Alex, your grandfather needs family support," she'd tell me during uncomfortable conversations. "Military careers are fine for young people, but eventually you need to think about settling down and taking care of the people who took care of you." Michael and Jennifer were even more direct in their criticism, suggesting that my military service was a phase that I should grow out of and that my continued absence from family events showed a selfish prioritization of career over relationships. "Normal people don't stay in the military forever," Michael would say during family dinners. "Eventually you need to get a real job and contribute to family responsibilities instead of expecting other people to handle everything." What they didn't understand, and what I couldn't explain to them, was that my military service wasn't a career choice, it was a calling that my grandfather had prepared me for and a way of honoring the values he'd instilled in me. Every promotion, every successful mission, every soldier I led safely through dangerous situations was a tribute to his training and belief in my potential. As the years passed and my responsibilities increased, the distance between my grandfather and me grew wider. I was promoted to captain, then major, then lieutenant colonel, leading increasingly complex operations and managing larger units of soldiers. My grandfather's letters became less frequent and more focused on Patricia's family activities than on my military achievements. The most painful development was realizing that my grandfather seemed to have forgotten the pride he'd once taken in my success. The man who'd attended every high school award ceremony and had cried when I graduated from West Point now seemed indifferent to my military accomplishments and more interested in discussing Patricia's children's minor achievements than my major ones. "That's nice, dear," became his standard response when I'd share news about promotions or successful missions. The enthusiasm and detailed questions about my leadership challenges that had characterized our earlier relationship were replaced by polite but distant acknowledgments that felt like obligations rather than genuine interest. By the time I was promoted to colonel, I'd largely given up trying to maintain a close relationship with my grandfather. It was too painful to feel like a stranger to the man who'd raised me, and I was too busy with military responsibilities to keep fighting for connection with someone who seemed to have chosen his new family over our shared history. What I didn't know was that Patricia had been systematically poisoning my grandfather against me for years, convincing him that my military success was evidence of my selfishness and that my absence from family events meant I no longer cared about him. She'd turned my greatest achievements into proof of my worst character flaws, and my grandfather had been manipulated into believing her narrative over his own experiences raising me. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the truth about Patricia's manipulation and deliver justice in the most dramatic way possible. The last phase of my grandfather's life was marked by increasing isolation from the military community that had defined his identity and growing dependence on Patricia's family for daily support and social connection. What I didn't realize at the time was that this isolation was carefully orchestrated by Patricia, who understood that separating him from his military friends and former colleagues would make him more susceptible to her influence and less likely to receive alternative perspectives about my character and achievements. Patricia had convinced my grandfather that his military friends were bad influences who encouraged him to live in the past instead of focusing on his current family responsibilities. She gradually eliminated his participation in veteran organizations, military reunions, and social activities that had previously been central to his retirement happiness. "James, you need to focus on the family you have now," she'd tell him whenever his old Marine buddies would invite him to events. "Those military people don't understand what it's like to have real family responsibilities." The manipulation was sophisticated and persistent. Patricia would schedule family activities that conflicted with military events, then frame his choice to attend family functions as evidence of his commitment to his new priorities. She'd make negative comments about military people who can't adapt to civilian life and live in the past instead of building future relationships. Michael and Jennifer reinforced their mother's anti-military messaging by constantly complaining about military types who thought they were better than everyone else and who expected special treatment because of their service. They'd make dismissive comments about military achievements and suggest that people who stayed in the military were too rigid or too insecure to succeed in civilian careers. Military people think the world owes them something, Jennifer would say during family conversations. They never learn how to have normal relationships or contribute to civilian communities. During this period, my grandfather's health began declining due to age-related issues and the stress of managing family dynamics that he didn't fully understand. Patricia positioned herself as his primary caregiver and decision-maker, gradually taking control of his medical appointments, financial decisions, and social calendar. The most devastating blow came 18 months before his death, when I received a letter from my grandfather informing me that I was no longer welcome at family gatherings because my military attitude was disruptive to family harmony and my absence from family responsibilities had shown that I prioritized career over relationships. Alex, the letter said, Patricia has helped me understand that your military career has changed you into someone who doesn't value family the way you were raised to. Until you're ready to make family a priority and treat Patricia and her children with the respect they deserve, it's better if you don't visit. The letter felt like a physical blow. The grandfather who'd raised me to be strong, independent, and dedicated to service was now telling me that those very qualities made me unsuitable for family relationships. The man who'd been proud of my military achievements was now treating them as evidence of my moral failure. I tried calling to discuss the situation, but Patricia always answered the phone and explained that my grandfather was too upset to talk to me. I wrote letters trying to explain my perspective and express my love for him, but I never received responses. My attempts to visit were met with locked doors and messages that I was not welcome until I was ready to apologize for years of selfish behavior. The isolation was complete and devastating. The most important person in my life, the man who'd saved me from abandonment and shaped me into the person I'd become, had been convinced that I was a selfish failure who'd wasted his investment in my development. What made the situation even more painful was that my military career was actually reaching new heights during this period. I was promoted to brigadier general at 42, making me one of the youngest women ever to achieve that rank. The promotion was recognition of exceptional leadership during multiple combat deployments and outstanding performance in increasingly complex command positions. But I had no one to share the achievement with. The grandfather who'd once been my biggest supporter was now convinced that my success was evidence of my failure as a human being. The promotion ceremony that should have been a celebration of everything he'd taught me became a reminder of how completely I'd lost the person who mattered most. The final communication came 6 months before his death, when I received a formal letter from Patricia's lawyer informing me that my grandfather had changed his will to exclude me entirely, leaving his entire estate to Patricia and her children. The letter explained that this decision reflected his disappointment in my choices and his desire to support family members who had actually been present during his final years. The legal document was followed by a personal note from Patricia. Alex, James wanted you to know that he's proud of what you accomplished in the military, but he's sad that your career prevented you from being the granddaughter he needed. He hopes you'll understand that his estate should go to the people who actually took care of him. When my grandfather died suddenly of a heart attack 3 months later, I learned about his death through an obituary in the local newspaper. Patricia hadn't contacted me, and the funeral arrangements were already finalized by the time I discovered that the most important person in my life was gone. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. When I called to ask about funeral arrangements, Patricia informed me that I was not welcome at the service because my presence would be disruptive and painful for the family members who had actually been there for my grandfather during his final years. That's when I made the decision that would lead to the most satisfying revenge of my life. I was going to honor my grandfather's memory regardless of what his manipulative wife and her toxic children wanted, and I was going to do it in a way that would expose the truth about who I really was and what he'd actually meant to me. Despite being banned from my grandfather's funeral, I was determined to honor the man who'd shaped my entire life and had died believing lies about my character and dedication to family. The pain of losing him was amplified by the knowledge that his final years had been poisoned by people who'd convinced him that his greatest achievement, raising me to be a successful military leader, was actually evidence of his failure as a grandfather. But I had resources that Patricia and her family couldn't understand or anticipate. 25 years of military service had built a network of relationships based on mutual respect, shared sacrifice, and understanding of what it means to honor those who shaped us. When I reached out to my military contacts for support in honoring my grandfather's memory, the response was immediate and overwhelming. My command sergeant major, a grizzled veteran named Thomas Rodriguez who'd served with me through multiple deployments, was the first to volunteer. "General, any Marine who raised someone like you deserves military honors, regardless of what his civilian family thinks about it." Within 48 hours, I had 12 Marines and soldiers volunteer to serve as an honor guard for my grandfather's funeral, even though they'd never met him personally. These were active-duty service members who understood that honoring the military family members who'd shaped successful leaders was part of their duty to the profession of arms. "Ma'am," Staff Sergeant Jennifer Martinez told me during our planning meeting, "your grandfather was a Marine who served his country and raised a general. That makes him family to all of us, and Marines don't let family be dishonored." The funeral was scheduled for 1,400 hours on a Saturday at the civilian cemetery where my grandmother was buried. Patricia had arranged for a simple service with a civilian minister and had specifically requested that there be no military elements because my grandfather had moved beyond his military identity in his final years. What Patricia didn't know was that I'd been in contact with several of my grandfather's old Marine buddies, men in their 70s and 80s who'd served with him in Vietnam and had been gradually excluded from his life during his marriage to Patricia. These veterans were outraged to learn that Colonel James Thompson was being buried without military honors and that his granddaughter had been banned from the service. "Alex," retired Gunnery Sergeant William Parker told me during a phone call, "your grandfather talked about you constantly when we served together. You were his pride and joy, and he'd be spinning in his grave if he knew what that woman was doing to his memory." The plan we developed was respectful but dramatic. I would attend the funeral in my dress blue uniform, accompanied by a 12-person honor guard representing different branches of the military. We would arrive after the civilian service had begun, position ourselves at a respectful distance, and render military honors to a fallen Marine at the conclusion of the civilian ceremony. The honor guard consisted of Marines from my grandfather's old unit, soldiers from my current command, and veterans who'd served with him over the years. Each member understood that we were there to honor a Marine's memory and to demonstrate that military family extends beyond biological relationships to include everyone who understands the meaning of service and sacrifice. "This isn't about disrupting their service," I explained to the honor guard during our final planning meeting. "This is about ensuring that a Marine receives the honors he earned and that his military legacy is properly recognized, regardless of what his civilian family prefers." The morning of the funeral, I received intelligence from one of my grandfather's old Marine friends who planned to attend the civilian service. Patricia had invited a small group of family and friends, but had specifically excluded anyone with military connections. The service would be brief and focused on my grandfather's civilian accomplishments and his dedication to his family. "Alex," retired Master Sergeant David Chin told me, "they're planning to pretend your grandfather was never a Marine. No mention of his military service, no recognition of his awards, nothing about the 30 years he gave to his country." That information crystallized my determination to ensure that my grandfather's military service was properly honored, regardless of his widow's preferences. A Marine who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam and earned a Purple Heart and Silver Star deserved better than a sanitized civilian funeral that ignored the most meaningful aspects of his life. As I prepared for what would be the most emotionally challenging day of my military career, I reflected on the lessons my grandfather had taught me about courage, integrity, and standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. He'd raised me to be a leader who didn't back down from important fights, and honoring his memory properly was the most important fight I'd ever face. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose Patricia's manipulation, demonstrate the true extent of my grandfather's military legacy, and deliver justice for a Marine who deserved better than the disrespectful send-off his widow had planned. The morning of my grandfather's funeral, I stood in front of my mirror adjusting my dress blue uniform and thinking about the man who'd taught me that courage means doing what's right regardless of the consequences. The 12 ribbons on my chest represented years of service, multiple combat deployments, and leadership achievements that had started with lessons learned at his kitchen table when I was 8 years old. At 1,345 hours, 15 minutes before the scheduled service, my honor guard assembled in the cemetery parking lot. 12 service members in full dress uniforms, representing the Army, Marines, Navy, and Air Force, all there to honor a Marine they'd never met but whose legacy lived on in the general he'd raised. The sight of them standing at attention, prepared to render honors to a fellow veteran, filled me with pride and determination. Honor guard, attention! Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez called as I approached. 12 sets of boots snapped together in perfect unison, 12 salutes were rendered with precision that would have made my grandfather tear up with pride. We positioned ourselves at the edge of the cemetery, close enough to observe the civilian service but far enough away to avoid disrupting it initially. Through binoculars, I could see Patricia and her family gathered around the gravesite with about 30 other people, friends, neighbors, and a few distant relatives who'd probably never known my grandfather well enough to understand what they were witnessing. The civilian minister began the service with generic platitudes about a life well lived and a man who loved his family. No mention of 30 years of military service. No recognition of combat deployments or decorations earned in service to his country. No acknowledgement that Colonel James Thompson had been anything more than a civilian retiree who'd happened to be married to Patricia. "This is disgraceful," whispered Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, whose own grandfather had been a Marine. "They're erasing everything that made him who he was." As the service progressed, I watched Patricia's performance with growing anger. She dabbed at her eyes with tissues, leaned on Michael and Jennifer for support, and played the role of grieving widow with practiced skill. But there was something calculated about her grief, something that felt more like relief than genuine sorrow. When the minister concluded his remarks and invited family members to share memories, Patricia spoke about my grandfather's devotion to family and his joy in his final years surrounded by people who truly understood and appreciated him. The implication was clear: she and her children had provided him with the family connection that I had failed to offer. Michael shared a story about my grandfather helping him with business advice and teaching him about responsibility and hard work. Jennifer talked about his wisdom and patience in accepting her and her brother as real family members despite their not being his biological relatives. Not one word about his military service. Not one story about his courage under fire or his dedication to the Marines who'd served under his command. Not one mention of the Purple Heart he'd earned when shrapnel from a mortar round had nearly killed him while he was pulling wounded Marines to safety. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. "Honor guard, forward march," I commanded, and 12 sets of boots began moving in perfect synchronization toward the gravesite. The sound of military footsteps on cemetery grass drew immediate attention from the civilian mourners, and I could see Patricia's face transform from practiced grief to shocked recognition. We positioned ourselves in formation at the foot of my grandfather's grave, directly facing the civilian gathering. 12 service members at attention, representing thousands of Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen who understood what Colonel James Thompson had meant to his country and his corps. "Present arms," I commanded, and 12 hands snapped to sharp salutes that honored a fallen Marine with the precision and respect he'd earned through 3 decades of service. The civilian gathering fell silent, staring at a display of military honors that Patricia had tried to prevent. "Ma'am," Staff Sergeant Williams called out, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery, "General Thompson, would you please accept the condolences of the United States Marine Corps on the loss of Colonel James Thompson, a Marines Marine who served his country with honor and distinction." The words General Thompson hit the civilian gathering like a physical blow. Patricia's mouth fell open, Michael and Jennifer looked confused and panicked, and several of the neighbors began whispering excitedly about the revelation that the failed granddaughter they'd heard about was actually a general in the United States Army. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "Colonel Thompson would be honored by your presence here today." Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez stepped forward with a folded American flag that we'd brought specifically for this moment. "General, on behalf of a grateful nation and the United States Marine Corps, please accept this flag in recognition of Colonel Thompson's faithful service to his country." As I accepted the flag, the honor guard remained at attention, saluting a Marine who was finally receiving the recognition he deserved. The contrast between our military precision and the civilian gathering's shocked silence was stark and intentional. Patricia found her voice first, her tone angry and defensive. "Excuse me, but this is a private family service. You're not welcome here, and you need to leave immediately." "Ma'am," Gunnery Sergeant Martinez replied respectfully, "we're here to honor a Marine who served his country for 30 years. Colonel Thompson earned the right to military honors, regardless of his family's preferences." That's when one of my grandfather's old Marine buddies, retired Master Sergeant David Chen, stepped forward from among the civilian mourners. "Patricia, this is General Alexander Thompson, Colonel Thompson's granddaughter. She's here to honor the man who raised her and shaped her into one of the finest military leaders of her generation." The revelation that the failed granddaughter was actually a general created a ripple of shocked murmurs through the civilian gathering. Neighbors who'd heard Patricia's stories about my selfish military career were suddenly seeing me in full dress uniform, accompanied by an honor guard, rendering military honors to my grandfather with obvious love and respect. Jennifer found her voice next. "This is ridiculous. Grandpa James moved beyond his military identity years ago. He wouldn't want this kind of display." "Miss," retired Gunnery Sergeant Parker said, stepping forward to join Master Sergeant Chen, "I served with Colonel Thompson for 15 years. That Marine lived and breathed the Corps until the day he died. Anyone who says otherwise didn't know him at all." The confrontation that followed would expose Patricia's lies, vindicate my grandfather's memory, and deliver the most satisfying military justice of my career. What happened next was the most emotionally powerful moment of my military career and the complete vindication of everything my grandfather had taught me about courage, integrity, and standing up for what's right. As more of my grandfather's old Marine buddies emerged from the civilian gathering to stand with us, the true story of Colonel James Thompson began to emerge, destroying Patricia's carefully constructed narrative about his final years. "General Thompson," retired First Sergeant Robert Hayes said, addressing me with the respect my rank deserved, "your grandfather talked about you constantly during our monthly Marine gatherings. He was prouder of your military achievements than anything else in his life, until that woman convinced him to stop seeing his old friends." Patricia's face went white as more veterans stepped forward to contradict her claims about my grandfather's attitude toward military service and his feelings about my career. Retired Staff Sergeant Michael Warren pulled out his phone and began reading from text messages my grandfather had sent him just months before his death. "Alex made General, James wrote to me last year. Youngest woman ever to achieve that rank in her career field. I taught her everything she needed to know, and she surpassed every expectation I had for her. I couldn't be prouder." The civilian mourners were staring in shock as the truth about my grandfather's pride in my achievements was revealed by the Marines who'd actually maintained contact with him throughout his marriage to Patricia. Every story she'd told about his disappointment in my military career was being systematically destroyed by people who'd heard the real version directly from him. Master Sergeant Chen stepped forward with evidence that would complete Patricia's humiliation. "General, your grandfather asked me to give you this if anything happened to him." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. I opened the letter with shaking hands, and what I found inside was everything I'd needed to hear during the painful final years of our relationship. "Alex, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you're probably heard about how things ended between us. I want you to know that you were the greatest achievement of my life, and every day I was prouder of the Marine I helped create. Patricia convinced me that pushing you away would help her children feel more accepted, but I never stopped loving you or believing in you. You are everything I raised you to be: strong, honorable, and dedicated to something bigger than yourself. Don't let anyone tell you that your service was a waste or that you failed as a granddaughter. You honored me every day by being the kind of leader I always knew you could become. I've left instructions with my lawyer for a trust fund that Patricia doesn't know about. Everything I actually valued, my military awards, my Marine Corps memorabilia, and $500,000 in savings I kept separate from our joint accounts, belongs to you. You earned it by being the granddaughter I always wanted and the general I always knew you'd become. Semper Fi, my dear girl. Your old Marine grandpa. The letter was accompanied by a key to a safe deposit box and legal documentation showing that my grandfather had maintained a separate trust specifically for me, hidden from Patricia throughout their marriage. He'd never stopped believing in me or planning for my future, he'd just been manipulated into thinking that showing his pride was harmful to his marriage. Patricia's reaction to this revelation was immediate and vicious. That's impossible. James told me everything. He left everything to me in his will. Ma'am, the lawyer who'd helped my grandfather establish the trust said, stepping forward from among the mourners, Colonel Thompson was very clear that his military legacy and personal assets should go to the person who'd actually earned them through service and sacrifice. Mrs. Henley, you were left the house and his retirement income, but his military honors and savings were always intended for General Thompson. The complete destruction of Patricia's narrative was visible on her face as she realized that her manipulation hadn't been as successful as she'd believed. My grandfather had been playing a longer game, protecting his relationship with her while ensuring that his real legacy would go to the person who deserved it. But the most satisfying moment came when Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez called for final honors. Present arms for final salute. 12 hands snapped to perfect salutes as taps began playing from a bugler who'd appeared from among the veterans in attendance. As the final notes of taps faded across the cemetery, I felt a peace that I hadn't experienced since childhood. My grandfather was being honored as a Marine should be, by people who understood what his service had meant and what his legacy represented. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Patricia's attempts to claim moral authority over my grandfather's memory were destroyed by the testimony of veterans who'd known the real James Thompson. Her claims about my failure as a granddaughter were exposed as lies by people who'd heard him express pride in my achievements throughout our supposed estrangement. Most satisfying was watching Michael and Jennifer realize that their inheritance expectations had been based on incomplete information. The man they'd assumed was a lonely retiree with no family connections had actually been a respected Marine with a network of brothers who'd been watching Patricia's manipulation with growing concern and documenting everything for future reference. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my office at the Pentagon, where I've been assigned as Deputy Director of Military Personnel Policy, surrounded by my grandfather's Marine Corps memorabilia and awards. The trust he'd established has allowed me to create a scholarship fund for military children who faced family abandonment or manipulation, ensuring that other young people can pursue military careers without financial pressure to choose between service and family approval. The most meaningful addition to my office is a framed photo from the funeral, 12 service members saluting my grandfather's grave while I stand at attention holding the American flag we presented in his honor. It's a reminder that military family extends beyond blood relationships to include everyone who understands the meaning of service, sacrifice, and honor. Patricia's social standing in the community was destroyed when the truth about her manipulation became public knowledge. Neighbors who'd believed her stories about my selfish abandonment of my grandfather were horrified to learn that she'd systematically isolated a decorated Marine from his military friends and convinced him to question his relationship with a granddaughter who'd become a general. Michael and Jennifer faced their own consequences when they realized that their inheritance consisted of household furniture and a small portion of my grandfather's retirement income, while the real assets, his military legacy, personal savings, and meaningful possessions, had always been intended for me. Their years of manipulation had earned them nothing except the social embarrassment of being exposed as people who'd exploited an elderly veteran for financial gain. The Marine Corps community rallied around my grandfather's memory in ways that would have made him incredibly proud. His old unit established an annual award in his name for Marines who demonstrate exceptional dedication to developing junior personnel. The local VFW post renamed their meeting hall in his honor. Most importantly, his story became a cautionary tale about protecting elderly veterans from family members who might exploit their loneliness or vulnerability. But the sweetest revenge was personal and ongoing. Every day, I get to honor my grandfather's memory by being exactly the leader he raised me to be. Every soldier I develop, every mission I complete successfully, every moment when I demonstrate the courage and integrity he instilled in me is a tribute to his legacy that no amount of manipulation could destroy. The scholarship fund established in his memory has already helped 50 military children pursue education and careers without having to choose between their goals and family pressure. Each recipient learns about Colonel James Thompson and the importance of supporting military families who understand that service to country sometimes requires difficult choices that civilian families might not appreciate. I've also become an advocate for elderly veterans who face isolation or manipulation from family members who don't understand or respect their military service. Too many decorated veterans spend their final years being convinced that their service was meaningless or that their pride in military achievements is somehow inappropriate or outdated. My personal life has been transformed by finding people who understand and respect military service rather than viewing it as competition for attention or resources. I'm currently in a relationship with a fellow general who shares my commitment to service and understands that honoring my grandfather's memory is central to who I am as a person and as a leader. The contrast with Patricia's approach to family relationships couldn't be more stark. Real love means supporting someone's achievements and understanding what makes them proud, not manipulating them into abandoning the values and relationships that define them. Most importantly, I've learned that my grandfather never actually stopped believing in me or being proud of my achievements. The distance between us during his final years was artificial, created by people who felt threatened by our bond and who couldn't understand that love doesn't require abandoning your principles or diminishing your accomplishments. So here's my question for all of you: have you ever had family members try to turn your loved ones against you out of jealousy or greed? How would you handle discovering that someone you loved had been manipulated into believing lies about your character? Do you think Patricia and her children got appropriate consequences for manipulating an elderly veteran? I love hearing from other military families and anyone who's faced manipulation from people who felt threatened by their success or close relationships. Drop your stories in the comments below, whether it's about family members who tried to exploit elderly relatives, people who viewed your achievements as threats to their own standing, or situations where you had to fight to honor someone's memory properly. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about military families, honoring our veterans, and standing up to people who would manipulate vulnerable elderly people for their own gain. Share this video with anyone who serves or has military family. Awareness about elder manipulation can protect our veterans from people who would exploit their service and sacrifice. Thank you for watching my grandfather's story and mine. Remember, you don't owe loyalty to people who would manipulate your loved ones or try to destroy meaningful relationships for their own benefit, regardless of their family status. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is expose manipulation and ensure that heroes get the honor they deserve. Here's to Colonel James Thompson, United States Marine Corps, who raised a general and whose legacy of service continues through everyone he influenced. Here's to military families who understand that service to country is a calling worth respecting and supporting. And here's to the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it means confronting people who've tried to poison the relationships you value most. Until next time, keep serving with honor and never let anyone convince you that your achievements are less important than keeping peace with people who don't deserve your respect. The best revenge really is living well, but sometimes it's also making sure that heroes get the military honors they earned and the recognition they deserve. Semper Fi, Grandpa. Your Marine granddaughter did you proud.